Quartered safe out here is George MacDonald Fraser's memoir of his experiences as a young soldier in the British Army during World War II's Burma campaign. Blending humor and stark realism, Fraser vividly recounts life on the front lines, capturing the camaraderie and harsh realities of war. Let's begin. The fight to retain Meiktila was long and bitter, as the Japanese concentrated every unit and formation they could to break 14th Army's stranglehold. It is a tribute to the Japanese that nobody had any doubt that, rather than break off the fight and withdraw, they would launch a counteroffensive with every unit they could assemble. Although 17th Division was surrounded by numerically superior forces, Cowan's policy was to retain the initiative by using a very small number of troops for static defense and sending out columns in all directions to strike at Japanese communications and enemy forces which had cut his own land communication. What I have described so far was the static defense of Meiktila, and as far as that was concerned, 9th Section had it cushy, doing stag, mounting the occasional observation post, keeping our weapons clean, and waiting to be sent out Jap hunting in force with the Sherman tanks of Probbins Horse. The Japanese attacked the wire elsewhere, I believe, but never in our sector, and while we were inside the perimeter, life was tranquil. Snapshots of memory, playing in one game of football on the bare space behind our rifle pits and being impressed by the brilliance of a young centre-half from Workington, who came close to an England cap a few years later, and the speedy reflexes of an officer from another platoon. He was a Cameron Highlander, and I had occasion to note his speed later on. Also, the bone-shattering violence of the man marking me, the regimental sergeant major no less, who was completely bald, what Parker called a lovely head of skin, and who gave me the only wound I received in the war, a neat little scar on my left knee. Watching someone do number 2 field punishment. Number 1, which consisted of being tied to a gun wheel, had gone out by that time, but number 2 looked decidedly unpleasant, having to run in circles, wearing full equipment, which included the big pack pouches, rifle, etc., in the boiling sun under the supervision of a blue-chinned member of the provost staff. I do not know what the accused had done, but he came off in a state of near collapse. It did him no permanent damage, for only last year, as a sprightly pensioner, he was singing his head off at our reunion in Carlisle Cathedral. If that kind of punishment seems barbaric, it should be noted that in the Chindits, there was at least one case of flogging with parachute cord. I think it was for sleeping on stag. The officer who ordered it was a charming man and a splendid soldier, with whom I had a friendly correspondence after the war. On the whole, though, much as I admired him, I think that if he had tried it with me, I would have shot him. Being mocked for using a knife and fork. We had 3 meals a day, ideally, breakfast, tiffin, and supper, punctuated by brew-ups of tea whenever we got the chance. As I remember, breakfast was bacon, beans, burgoo, and bread, tiffin was liable to be bully beef and biscuits and tinned fruit, supper would be either bully stew, a waste of good bully beef, in my opinion, or McConaughey's superb stewed steak, which came in dark green cans as part of the compo ration, a large tin container holding a day's food for the section, including potatoes and vegetables. These, with eggs boiled to bullet hardness, tinned fish, which we never ate, but used for barter, rice pudding, and occasional duff, were the basic foods, and very good they were. In Meiktila, and for most of the campaign, all food was dropped from the air, and later in the campaign, when the monsoon made flying impossible, we were on half rations for a month. This was no great hardship since by then we were down south and could get mangoes, bananas, and occasional livestock from the villages, usually by barter. When we were away from the company cookhouse, we made our own meals over the section fire, and it was on such an occasion that I remember being jeered at because, unlike the others, who scooped their stew from their mess tins with their spoons, I insisted on using my knife and fork. "Hey Nick, get a napkin for fucking Lord Fauntleroy." This, I maintain, wasn't affectation, I just wasn't at ease eating meat and potatoes with a spoon. It didn't feel right and no doubt stamped me as hopelessly bourgeois and Christopher Robin. I noticed that the Duke, the section's aristo, shoveled his McConaughey's down with a spoon in the best grandma style. Occasionally, we had K-ration, that American abomination designed, I believe, by Wingate. It contained, among other things, a tiny tin of hideous eggy gunge, a nutty candy bar, 3 Camel cigarettes, and 3 sheets of toilet paper, which drew Rabelaisian comments from the section, who wondered if them Yank buggers had never heard of grass. I cannot leave our rations without mentioning that splendid item on which, in its various forms, British servicemen have thriven for centuries, the small, square, rough half-biscuit half-oatcake known as hardtack. I, at least, never got tired of them, topped with little cubes of bully and accompanied by floods of tea. They make one of the great meals and were in every way superior to the bread issue which, like all Indian loaves, was shiny, musty, and slightly stale. The discovery that I had a genius for brewing tea. I am not modest about this, I am probably the greatest tea brewer in the history of mankind. It is an art, And I have the unanimous word of 9 section, even Forster, eventually, that I brought it to the pitch of perfection. They were connoisseurs who, or at least I like to think that I imposed connoisseurship on them once I had weaned them away from Gurkha tea, which consisted largely of condensed milk, to which the Gurkhas were addicted. Show me the Indian soldier who isn't. Brewing up is not merely a matter of infusing tea, making the fire comes into it, and when you have lit and maintained fires in the monsoon, you have nothing more to learn. That came later. At Meiktila, it was a simple business of assembling bamboo slivers, igniting them, no small thing, with Indian lion matches which invariably broke and sprayed the striker with flaming phosphorus, and bringing about a gallon of water to the boil in the section brew tin. This was a jealously guarded article, about a foot cubed, made by cutting a compo ration tin in two and piercing the rim for a handle of signal wire. The casting in of the tea leaves from the section box was the crucial thing, followed by the ceremonial dropping in of 2 broken matchsticks to attract stray leaves. Remove the tin from the heat, invite the guests to scoop out the brew with their pialas, and tea was served, each man adding sugar and condensed milk to taste. The ritual was complete when Grandmas had sipped, appraised, and exclaimed, Christ, thu brews a canny cup, Jock. If he hadn't said it, or had even varied the phrase, it would have been like someone passing the port to the right. When we get back, said Steele, you'll have to open a shop, Doon Botchagate, near the auction mart. Brew in cha, you'll make a bloody fortune. Jock's brew shop, said Grandmas. With a sign, a black cat, with its arsehole wreathed in smiles. Hire a bloody big Sikh Duruan, and all, with a lati. Keep the customers in order. Tanner a cup, nor, make everybody bring his own piala. Ye nor, give it atmosphere. Or ever stack of pialas and mess tins at the door. What he wants, said Parker, is to make it real authentic. First off, it ain't a shop, it's a backyard, knee-deep in shit. And nobody gets any cha till he's dug a slit trench, see? And it all is to happen in the pissin' rain. Issue picks, shovels, and pialas at the door, then get soaked, you'll maybe need a shower, Jock, then out they goes, digs their pit, and you give 'em a brew up. 2 chips a time, how about that? It sounds attractive, I said. Think anyone would come? Bleed in millions, yank tourists, and that. Live the joys of active service with our gallant lads. Have an authentic 14th Army cuppa from Jock, brew artist supreme. I tell you, they'd come flockin'. You could import them big ants, and put 'em in the sugar, our bleed-in tins got thousands of the bastards. You wouldn't want to hire a Jap sniper, too? Nah, that'd be overdoing it, I dunno, though, you might give him blanks and let the customers kill the little sod. They elaborated, with unmentionable details. I took it as a great tribute. But think on, said Forster. Ye'll have to get pay. Rob the buggers blind, J. Och. And he rubbed finger and thumb together, Shylock-like, and quoted, Tora Chini, Tora Dude. Which means, in Urdu, a little sugar, a little milk, and set him off singing Dialali Sahib, one of the forgotten soldier songs of India, to the tune of There Is a Happy Land. Tora Chini, Tora Cha. Bombay Bibi, Baua Cha. 16 annas ek rupee. 17 annas ek bakshi. Oh Dialali Sahib. Oh Dialali Sahib. May the boat that you go home on. Nish Rako Pani, Sahib. I give only the printable lines, noting that Bibi is a girl, Baua Cha means very good, and the last line translates literally as under rest water, which was the nearest soldiers Urdu could come to sink to the bottom of the sea. It is an odd reflection on our present standards that if Dialali Sahib was sung on television today, its obscenities would pass unremarked, since they are all in regular use in the media, but there would certainly be a prosecution under the Race Relations Act. Like most of our songs, it was sung either on the march or when traveling by truck. Campfire vocalizing was almost unknown, and Forster's was the only case I remember, not so much for itself but because it was followed by Parker's rendering of a ditty picked up in the China Wars, to the tune of Bye Bye, Blackbird. Wrap up all my care and woe. Here I go, swinging low. Bye bye, Shanghai. Won't somebody wait for me? Please get in a state for me. Bye bye, Shanghai. Up before the colonel in the morning. He gave me a rocket and a warning. You've been out with Sun Yat-sen. You won't go out with him again. Shanghai, bye bye. It was a section favorite, and perhaps I remember so vividly hearing it for the first time, sung softly in the firelight with Parker moving his piala to the music, because that was almost the last time I brewed up for the whole of 9 section as it was at the start of the campaign. The next day, our part in the static defense of Meiktila ended, and we went out in strength to look for Jap. The method was simplicity itself. A company, or perhaps two, more than 200 riflemen, would climb on the battered Sherman tanks and rumble out of the perimeter. If authority had marked down a Japanese concentration, the tanks would often take us all the way. If it was a probe, we dismounted and marched, sweeping the countryside until the enemy was encountered. Riding the Sherman spared the feet, but it had its disadvantages. After an hour or so, the metal became so hot that you had constantly to change position to avoid being roasted, and the water shaggles took considerable punishment. By then, we were coated so thick with dust that our faces looked as though we were wearing number 9 makeup, and it was almost a relief to slide down and walk. There are two great descriptions of marching: Kipling's poem, Boots, a remarkable work of art since he can have endured the pain of foot slogging in the sun only at second hand, and P.C. Wren's passage in The Wages of Virtue. I marched far farther in training in England, and in India, than ever I did in Burma. 22 miles in a day is my record, and that was in North Africa after the war. It is painful, too, not so much on the feet as on the back and shoulders, where the equipment chafes. The official wisdom is that you should wear the small pack high up towards the neck, but I noticed that 9 section let them hang slack. Your feet are either fine or useless. My soles, by the end of the campaign, were white, spongy, and entirely devoid of feeling, but that was the monsoon. Not until 15 years later did they return to normal. At first, they just became raw, and by Pyobwi, they were hurting like sin, but not to incapacitate. It is a tribute to my small part of 14th Army, at least, that I never knew a man fall out with his feet. Some of them were in horrible condition, but they bathed them and patched them and anointed them with strange things from the medical officer and kept going. I have read, whether it is true or not, that in the Falklands War there were 20% casualties from feet. I find it hard to credit, but if it is true, it was no fault of the soldiers, but of the boots. Our Burma marches were modest, certainly by the standard of the retreat or the Impel campaign, but even they could be rough if you were fighting along the way, or getting wearier by the day from night actions or stand-tos. My lasting impression is of thirst, and the yearning to reach for the water bottle bumping on my stern, warm to hot though the contents were and highly flavored of chlorine and rust. You did not touch your water bottle until you had to, so I plowed moodily on, parched and sore, hating Preston Sturges, the film director, because in a copy of a magazine, Yank, probably, there was an article about him, describing how in his Hollywood office there was a soft drink tank, awash with clinking ice cubes and frosted bottles. It was enough to start you baying at the sun. And it was at such a time that Grandmas, who must have been more educated than he looked, would start to recite. You may talk a gin and beer when you're quartered safe out here. With coarse modifications to the verse which Kipling never thought of, but which I am sure he would have approved. I do not recall even the North Sahara being hotter or drier than the dry belt of Burma. It may be significant that Grandmas, having finished his recitation and stretched himself on the rocky earth with his hat over his lobster-colored face, should exclaim, "Wam? Ars aboot bugad. By hell, I could do with some fukin joongle, I tell tha." And the Duke, sighing and sweating, said thoughtfully that, on the whole, he thought Grandmas was right. From what I saw farther south, and the jungle I encountered 20 years later in Borneo, I am not sure I would agree. The dry belt might be hard and hot, but at least you could see where you were, and, with luck, the opposition. I had my first long look at them in numbers when we made our initial probe a few miles down the Rangoon Road, 2 companies of us with tanks of the Deccan Horse. Our own company's sweep encountered little, but the other company hit a village where the Japanese were dug in. The attack went in, 70 Japanese were killed, and 2 guns captured, but by dusk, we were outnumbered and cut off from Meiktila, 200 men and a troop of tanks, and had to fade into the dark and make a box. This was the night a tank brewed up on the road, and we lay off in the dark, sweating in the night cold and keeping quiet while we watched the Japanese swarming around the burning wreckage in a way which would have recalled Osbert Sitwell's remark about those clever, patriotic apes of Japanese hurling themselves about, if I had known it at the time. They looked like energetic khaki goblins, and when I whispered this to the Duke, lying alongside, we discovered that we had both suffered infant nightmares from George MacDonald's goblin stories. His imps had tender feet, without toes, and could be laid out by stamping on them. At this point, Sergeant Hutton told us to fucking shut up, and a moment later, the altercation broke out in the dark behind us, between Forster and a Sikh over the possession of a shaggle. It lasted all of 3 seconds before being snarled to silence. "Stupid sods," muttered the Duke. "Can you beat it? Forster's thirsty, so 200 men risk getting killed." The only other memory I have of that night is of the anxious, sweating face of a tank officer thrust close to mine, asking if everything was okay. He was crawling around the perimeter, which consisted of men lying on their weapons since there had been no time to dig in, and when I said we were fine, he exclaimed, "Thank God for that. Well done, well done." and scuttled off on all fours. It seemed an odd inquiry. Obviously everything was okay, inasmuch as the Japanese had not found us. If he did, it would not be. Another lesson noted: if you are jittery, keep it to yourself. My nerves were fine until he arrived. Afterwards, I was decidedly restless. There wasn't a Japanese to be seen at dawn, but since they were in large numbers between us and Meiktila, it was necessary to get into cover without delay. When a small force is cut off, as we were, the best it can do is hole up, wait for a chance to slip out, and in the meantime annoy the enemy in any way it can. It was something new to me, this 14th Army attitude of regarding a defensive position not as a place where you waited to be attacked, but as a base from which you sallied out to observe or clobber the foe. It was done on a big scale at Meiktila, and on a small one in the little village where we joined up with the rest of the battalion later that day, after a quick march through the dry paddy on which Grandmas trod on a crate, which is among the most venomous snakes on earth. It was a nasty shock to both of them. He cried "You booger!" and went up 3 feet, and the crate shot out from under and disappeared into a crack in the sun-baked earth. The village was a neat little stronghold, surrounded by a high embankment with openings north and south where the road ran through. This bank, which was plainly pre-war, had evidently been built as a defense against the ubiquitous Burmese bandits, and once we had strung wire beyond the outer slope and dug our pits on the inner one, we were nice and snug. The section brewed up, and while the light lasted, I started writing a short story about a 16th-century Highlander cruising through the wilds of Lochaber, who suddenly becomes aware that he is being stalked by a beautiful young woman who is even more expert a woodsman than he is. Considering our position, Freud, had he been there, would probably have said something trenchant, but all I got was Sergeant Hutton snapping, "Stop bloody scribbling, get off your ass, and get fellin' with your rifle and cookery. You're gan on tiger patrol. Put your PT shoes on, leave your hat, and report to Mr. Gale." "Are you going?" "Nah, juiced him and you and 2 others. Ye haven't done a tiger patrol afore, have ye?" "Nah, neither has Gale." He considered. "Aye. He's juiced a lad, but he's a good lad. Reet, get crackin'." Gale was perhaps a year or 2 older than I was, about 22. He had joined the battalion when I had, so he was not experienced. But he was, as Hutton said, a good lad, brisk, active, and with a gift of easy command, neither too stiff nor too affable, the kind of subaltern that the British Army has turned out by the thousand for centuries, and who, with the tough, worldly-wise Huttons, has been its sheet anchor. Nixon and Parker were the other 2, they and Gale were lightly shod and armed as I was. We assembled in a little basher in the gathering dusk, other patrols were forming up, and Long John was issuing orders to Stanley and a man from another platoon who were going out to an observation post in front of our position. It was all very businesslike and unhurried, quiet voices and shadowy figures, an occasional soft laugh among the mutter of orders, magazines being charged and safety catches going on, feet shuffling, the light of the storm lantern reflected on faces. Gale drew us aside and briefed us. There had been a lot of Japanese movement in the country around, and a big force was believed to be moving up towards Meiktila. It would probably pass some way to the east of our village, but flanking units or patrols were sure to bump us shortly. In the meantime, the battalion would be scouting every village within a 10-mile radius, watching for any concentration and doing whatever mischief we could. Tonight we're recceing a couple of villages, see if Japs in residence pick up news. He looked at me. "You're the cross-country expert, right? If we run into trouble, and I shout runner, you get out fast. Understand? Don't wait for anything, get back to the battalion, tell 'em whatever we found. Okay?" We all nodded. "Let's go." His voice was level, but I could hear the suppressed excitement in it and wondered if he felt the same rising shiver at the back of the throat that I did. The villages might be stiff with Japanese, likewise the countryside. Suppose we got in among them, just 4 of us, and it came to a dirty melee in the dark? Well, I would just have to wait for the shout of runner, doing whatever seemed best in the meantime. For the life of me, I couldn't decide whether being the best long-distance runner in the platoon was a good thing or not. It really wasn't worth considering. We slipped out of the perimeter and stopped about 100 yards out, kneeling in a rough diamond formation to look and listen. Behind was the dark loom of the village, with a light here and there. The paddy itself was half dark, and I could easily make out the 3 dim forms, when we went on Gale led, with Parker and Nixon on either flank and a little behind him. I was the back point of the diamond. They went very quietly, pausing only when Gale stopped or sank to one knee. From the gloom around us, there was hardly a sound. If the Japanese were out there, they were being just as silent as we were. Now I know I must have been scared, but I don't remember it, not to compare with other occasions, where the memory of fear remains as strong as when I felt it. Looking back, I can say that night patrolling in enemy country, while not the ideal form of relaxation, was less hair-raising than I had expected. Put it another way, it was preferable to lurking in an observation post, for my money. Every normal person fears the dark, but if you have to face it, there is great reassurance to moving quietly in good company, traveling light and knowing that you have been well trained in the basics. Take your time, don't lose contact, when in doubt sink down and listen, and try to remember that darkness is a friend. The knowledge, which came later, that the Japanese were certainly no better in the dark than we were, was absent on that first Tiger patrol. Even so, the confidence with which Gale moved ahead, and the sureness and silence of the other two, gradually induced a feeling that had at least as much excitement as fear about it. Reading that last paragraph again, I wonder if I've gone mad at long last. It is one thing to sit quietly typing in one's study, recalling in safety the perils of 50 years ago and knowing perfectly well that the neighborhood is not full of malevolent tojos waiting to kill me. If it were, and I, an overweight pensioner, were fool enough to go out looking for them, I would blunder about in the dark, falling over everything, and probably die of apoplexy, and quite another to have to do the real thing. No, what I mean to convey is that there are worse things than night patrolling, as we shall see. It is a matter of taste, offered the choice, which at this stage I am comfortably certain I shall not be, between roaming the Burmese night on the off chance of meeting the Japanese and clearing an occupied bunker. I take the former, as offering a better chance of a happy return. But on the whole, I would much prefer a pint of black and tan. There were no Japanese in the first village, but there had been a few hours earlier. We skirted the place before going in, Gale conferring with the headman through the good offices of a smooth young villager who announced himself as a Bachelor of Arts from Rangoon University. About 50 Japanese had passed through during the morning, heading north. They had assured the headman that the British were about to be driven out of Meiktila and across the river. Already many had been ambushed and killed in unsuccessful attempts to break out, and the village was to keep an eye open for stragglers. This, said the young man, beaming ingratiatingly, the headman had pretended to believe, but he knew it was untrue. It occurred to me that the Japanese had been treated to the same wide grin that morning. We three kept in the shadows while Gale was talking. There could be no question of searching the place. If there had been Japanese concealed, they would have been shooting us up by now, and the villagers seemed easy and friendly enough, the old women sitting smoking in the shadows before the bashes, the children staring and grinning openly. We left from the north end of the village, circled it at a distance, and made southeast, so far as I could judge. The second village was about a mile farther on and was fast asleep. We came in quietly, among the silent bashes, freezing when somebody sneezed. A light appeared in one of the bashes, and presently a very old man shuffled out, demanding our business. He was fairly truculent, unlike most Burmese villages, especially when there are warring armies in their neighborhood. No, he had seen no Japanese for days, but they were coming soon. Everyone in the village was very frightened, and would we please go away? I guessed Gale was wondering what to do next when the sound of firing was heard, off to the south. At this, female hysterics broke out in the bashes, the old man shouted and ran for cover, and we left. The firing died away, but it was far outside our little theater of operations, and we made for home. Somebody's Avena Duffy was Parker's only comment. I supposed it was one of our patrols clashing with a party of Japanese, but I never found out. We hit the road south of our little base and came in through the wire without trouble, one member of the patrol at least effervescent with relief and not a little pleased with himself. Very well, nothing had happened, but at least I had been out there and back again, like the Wolf of Kabul and Hawkeye, and had not come to grief or made an ass of myself. Gale thanked us and told us to get our heads down, while he went off to report. Men from other returned patrols were dispersing, and I talked to a couple of them, concealing my elation and acting nonchalant. We was due in the shut-in, then. Don't know. We heard it, about a mile off. Aye. There's summit up, Dune Thier. Feller in headquarters company was sayin' Japs makin' a big push. Aye, Nick, who's to gan on? Not say bad. Any news? Ye what? I'll tell thee the fucking news. We're out air, git ourselves coot off. What a bloody balls up, eh? Couldn't ruin a bloody raffle. Isn't that reet, lad? I made a non-committal noise, like John Wayne at Fort Apache. Aye. Well, I's gan get mysel some Egyptian PT, afore Jap disturbs me beauty sleep. Neat, lads. Hold on a minute, son. I know you. Is thu Fay Coral? I admitted I was from Carlisle. I thought say. Dear away. You're Dr. Willie's daft son, up Curragh. I couldn't deny it, and he grinned and shook hands. Your dad was our doctor, afore we moved out Tivgil. We'll know what about that. And you're in 9 section, along with that old booger? Bad look, son. Ye belangs in the Chapoy Chindits, ye does. Don't ye, Nick? Well away. Dr. Willie's lad. I knew his family's name, but not him personally. We talked for a few minutes more, joked about having a pint back home someday, and parted. All of a sudden, I was ready to sleep on my feet. There was a 50% stand to, and half the section was in their pits, but Parker was already in his blanket, and I flopped down beside him, excited and drowsy all at once. It had been a big night for a young soldier, but here I was, back. It crossed my mind that I hadn't said my prayers for longer than I cared to remember, and I was in that thankful state when it seemed like a good idea. Long ago, when I was little, my father had used to kneel beside my bed, holding my hand and saying them with me. I could still feel the prickle of his moustache on my forehead when he kissed me goodnight, and then the landing light would go off, the door far off downstairs would close, and I would stare up at the odd pattern on the ceiling where the distant streetlight shone in above the curtains. It would be shining just the same now. And I had been on night patrol in Burma, and an idea had come to me out there for the short story I had started. Suppose the Highlander came to a village at nightfall, and there were a party of armed Camerons hunting the beautiful girl who had been stalking him. I came awake to the crash of explosions and the hard ground vibrating under me. All around, men were starting up. There were yells of command in the darkness, the stutter of a bren, the thump of grenades, flashes in the black, random shouts. I rolled into my pit, blanket and all, scrambling for rifle and pouches. Parker tumbled in beside me, and we ducked instinctively as Tracer streaked across our front beyond the wire. There were exclamations and blasphemous inquiries from the pits on either side, and then the word was passed along, Japs inside the wire. "Ah, sod it," said Parker, fumbling in the dark, and light flashed on his kukri as he laid it on the lip of the pit. "What the hell? Those are mortars, our 3-inch mortars." They were thumping away at the southern end of the village, away from us. That was where most of the firing was. Beyond our wire, there seemed to be nothing doing, but men were hurrying past close behind us. Someone was yelling, "Reaver platoon," and I thought I heard Long John's voice, and then Hutton's bawling, "8th section, close on me. Come on." The firing was sporadic, a few shots, a burst of automatic, then a scream that froze the blood, and from the left end of our position, a shocking worrying sound, as though a dog were tearing at something. Jesus wept. "Come on, jockey." Parker was out of the pit, and I was following when a burst of fire came from beyond the wire, right to our front. Parker dropped, and I stopped dead, staring at the darkness outside the wire. There were figures there, running, and they couldn't be any of ours. Parker was on one knee, firing towards them. I emptied my magazine, rapid fire, working the bolt for dear life until it clicked on an empty chamber. I heaved out of the pit, scrabbling for my bandolier. Parker had vanished, but another figure, rifle in hand, was on the top of the embankment before my pit, not a yard away, and even as my hand, rummaging in the dark for that damned bandolier, fell on the hilt of the dirk in my small pack, I froze in genuine horror. It happened in split seconds, as such things do, but in retrospect, it seems to have lasted forever. The figure was plainly silhouetted against the half-dark night sky. It was short and crouched and furtive, but what shocked me into momentary numbness was that it seemed to be wearing knickerbockers, loose above the knee, tight beneath. All in an instant, I remembered how Nick had identified the Gurkhas a few nights earlier, realized that this was a Japanese inside the wire, that my rifle was empty, that my hand was on my knife hilt. The figure took a quick step, his foot slipped over the edge of my pit, and as he stumbled, I grabbed him with my left hand and heaved him bodily across the pit. My right hand whipped the knife out, down and up in a frantic lunge, and the fallen figure exclaimed, "Fukinel." God bless the electric impulses of the brain. I couldn't stop the thrust, but I did open my fingers, the knife dropped, and my open hand hit him one hell of a clout in the kidneys. He yelped, echoing me, I should think, and then he fell into the pit, swearing, and I dragged him upright with my left hand still clutching his shirt. "Nick, what the hell are you on?" I probably sounded hysterical, for he said, "Bloody hell, Jock. You've bloody ruined me. You dumb sod." I remember shouting, and then the section bren interrupted me, and I let him go and found my bandolier, my hands shaking as I jammed in fresh clips. The air was thick with cordite smell, the shooting farther along the wire redoubled, the mortars were thumping away, and down at the south end, a star shell burst high up, at least, I think it must have done, for suddenly it was light for a moment, and Corporal Little was running past the pit shouting, "Come on, 9 section." I scrambled out, Nick swearing in my wake, and ran after Little, who was heading down into the village. That was the moment when I caught a fleeting glimpse of Long John. He was issuing an order to someone, I think, but you couldn't hear above the firing. He had a rifle in one hand, the bayonet bent almost at right angles. I learned later that he had bayoneted a Japanese and couldn't get it out until his Batman reminded him that the way to free a bayonet is to fire a shot into the body. The theory is that it lets in air, or releases pressure on the blade, or something. How it worked with that bayonet, God knows, but it did. Hutton was striding towards us out of the dark. "With the L ye gan, Titch? Where do ye want us?" shouted Little. Hutton swore, jerked his head round towards the firing, and made up his mind. "Niver mind that. They're in Doon yonder. Get in your pits and watch the wire. They're all over the bloody place." Stanley was beside him, trying to attract his attention. He had been on observation post beyond the wire. Hutton spoke to him, and as we ran back to our pits, Stanley followed us, throwing himself down beside my pit. Rifle fire seemed to be rattling everywhere, the flashes of the mortar explosions were visible over the bashes, and from the road within the village came the sharp crash of grenades. "Where's Wells?" shouted Stanley, grabbing my shoulder. I didn't know who Wells was, even. Stanley cursed, stood up, looked about him, let out a stream of oaths, which wasn't like him at all, and suddenly ran off, down into the village. Someone shouted after him, but he was lost in the darkness, and here was Hutton again, running in a crouch. "Fook me. Gideon." He was kneeling by my pit. "We's got grenades. Come on, man, gi them air." I was half into my webbing by now, so I tore open a pouch. Hutton grabbed my grenades, and then he was off towards the road. He disappeared behind a basher, and a moment later, we heard one of the grenades going off on the road. Little came crouched out of the dark, dropping beside my pit. "We's that? Jock? We's with thee?" "Nobody. I don't know where Parker is." "Back there. Have ye seen Stanley?" "He went off, that way." He swore. "All air, bar him, anyway. Watch your front." There was nothing outside the wire now but empty dark. Behind us, in the village and down towards the south entrance, it sounded like Dunkirk, and then gradually, the firing died away. There were a few more mortar explosions, but the voices that sounded in the dark were less urgent now, and I had time to get my breath back, wondering what the hell had happened. The attack had been one of those mad accidents. A column of Japanese had come up the road from the south in trucks, driven right up to the wire, climbed out, and then realized that we were in the village. They had attacked the wire, with our mortars hammering their trucks and their drivers trying to reverse or turn round and ruining their gears while the bombs rained down on them. It must have been chaos out yonder, but about a dozen Japanese had got inside the wire, and a hand-to-hand battle had broken out. Most of them had been killed on the road within the village, by grenades. As many more were killed by patrols that went out at dawn to look for stragglers, and others had died outside the wire during the night's fighting. Whether Parker and I had done any damage with our expenditure of about 5 shillings worth of ammunition, we never knew. The word passed that more than 50 Japanese had bought it, for the loss of 3 of us, including one of the men I had talked to just before turning in. My knife was still lying at the bottom of my pit when dawn broke, and I was considering its 8-inch blade and feeling slightly sick at the thought of what I had nearly done with it, when Nick loafed over, mess tins in hand, rubbing his back ribs. "Why, you're a start booger, you. Sick a bloody belt, man, you just about killed us." How little you know, I thought, and decided then and there not to tell him how close he had come to dying not Tojo's way, or his own way, but my way, or that only his penchant for 4-letter exclamations had saved him at the last instant. After all, you don't want your comrades in arms thinking that they can't even go to the latrine at night without the risk of being knifed by the maniac in the next pit. But one thing I must tell him, for his own safety in the future, for he still had on the physical training shoes he had worn on patrol, and his trousers were still tucked inside the socks, grey, long, soldiers for the use of, giving him that fashionable streamlined look almost up to the knee. I waited till we had been to the cookhouse and had returned with our bread, tea, and burgoo, keeping a wary eye open for the kites which could swoop down like spitfires and whip half your breakfast with surgical skill. When we were settled and munching contentedly, talking of other things, I asked casually, "Why'd you wear your socks like that, Nick?" "What for not? Me legs was cold." "You want to watch it, Mara? One of these nights somebody's liable to take you for a Jap. Remember what you told me in the observation post?" He surveyed his legs. "Gear away, man. Do I look like a fucking Jap, me?" "From the knees down, yes." No penny dropped. "All hit-eyed, man. Ye know, Jock, for an educated fella you doan't half talk some crap." Well, there was no denying that, so I said no more about it. No one ever did take him for a Jap by night after that, and my near murder has remained a secret until now. I was not the only one in the section guilty of suppressing the truth over the night's work, but Stanley had a much more creditable reason for his reticence. He had been in the observation post with Wells, and when the Japanese arrived, they had cut out for the wire. Stanley had made it into the perimeter, only to find that there was no sign of Wells. So he had slipped out again, without a word to anyone, when the fighting was at its height, into the Japanese-infested dark, to look for him. By sheer luck, he found him, near the observation post, dying of bayonet wounds. There was no way of helping him, but Stanley had stayed with him. He could have sought cover for himself, but he did not. I suppose he brought the dead man in at dawn, but my informant, who was not Stanley himself, wasn't sure of all the details. He had only learned the bare facts months later. I lost touch with Stanley after the war. We served together for most of the rest of the campaign, and he is one of the few men of whom I can say that we literally fought side by side. That came later, but I never knew him well. The picture of the tall, quiet, fair youth is not as sharp in my mind as that of Gramas or Nick or most of the others. But whenever I hear the word hero loosely used, as it so often is of professional athletes and media celebrities and people who may have done no more than wear a uniform for a while, I think of Stanley going back into the dark. That concludes the fourth part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider subscribing for more episodes.